When the black CO approached the boarding gate, he carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind of presence that only years of hard work, persistence, and resilience could shape. He had built his company from the ground up, turning it into one of the most respected firms in its industry. For him, traveling first class was not a luxury he stumbled upon. It was a symbol of the success he had rightfully earned. His ticket clearly stated first class, and just like any other passenger, he had every right to enjoy the comfort and privilege that came with it. But the moment he stepped forward, suitcase in hand, the atmosphere began to shift. The flight attendant's eyes scanned the line and settled on him, and instead of a polite greeting or standard check-in, she gave him a look that suggested he was out of place. It was the kind of look that carried layers of unspoken judgment, an assumption that someone like him could not possibly belong in the premium cabin. He handed over his boarding pass with a smile, expecting a routine scan, but her hesitation was immediate. She glanced at the ticket, then back at him, then at the ticket again, as if waiting for the paper to reveal some sort of mistake. "Are you sure this is your seat?" she asked, her tone sharp, almost accusatory. It was a question no other first-class passenger was being asked. Around him, others in line breezed past with their tickets barely glanced at, while his was held under suspicion, studied as if it might be counterfeit. The CO remained calm, keeping his composure, but inside he felt the familiar sting of being judged not by his achievements or his status, but by the color of his skin. She leaned forward, lowering her voice, but not enough to avoid drawing attention. "Sir, this is a first-class ticket. These seats are reserved for passengers who—" She stopped herself, but the implication was loud enough for nearby travelers to catch. People shifted uncomfortably, some pretending not to listen, others staring openly at the scene unfolding. For the CEO, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an intentional stripping away of dignity in a space where he had earned every right to be. He politely confirmed that the seat was indeed his, pointing to the details on the ticket, but the flight attendant wasn't convinced. She called another staff member over, and suddenly what should have been a smooth boarding process became a small spectacle. 2 employees now stood scrutinizing his boarding pass, whispering to each other, occasionally glancing at him as if he were trying to sneak into a section he didn't belong to. He noticed how other passengers looked at him now, some with curiosity, some with pity, and a few with the same disbelief the flight attendant carried. It wasn't the first time he had been underestimated or doubted, but this time it was different. This was happening in a public space, in front of strangers, during what was supposed to be a simple flight. The sting wasn't just in the questioning, it was in the assumption behind the questioning, that wealth, power, and success did not look like him. The attendant's voice grew louder as she insisted there must be some mistake, asking him to step aside so other passengers could board. With his carry-on bag beside him, he moved out of the line, standing silently as families, business travelers, and vacationers streamed past him into the cabin he had rightfully paid for. Every person who walked by was a witness to his humiliation, a silent audience to the way he was being treated. He felt the weight of their gazes, some sympathetic, others indifferent, and a few clearly entertained by the unfolding drama. The CO didn't raise his voice or protest. He knew that losing his temper would only feed into the narrative the attendant had already built about him, that he didn't belong, that he was causing trouble, that he wasn't the kind of person who deserved the seat he had bought. Instead, he watched carefully, allowing the situation to play out, knowing that every word, every action, and every slight would matter later. The flight attendant finally waved over her supervisor, explaining loudly that this passenger was trying to occupy a first-class seat that couldn't possibly be his. Her words carried an air of certainty, spoken as though the truth were already decided. When the supervisor approached, the CO quietly handed over his ticket once again, his calmness standing in stark contrast to the chaos being created around him. The supervisor scanned the ticket and immediately confirmed that it was valid, that the seat was his, and that there was no mistake. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable, and undeniable. The attendant's face shifted, the arrogance faltering for a moment, but instead of apologizing, she simply muttered something under her breath and gestured him toward the cabin. By then, however, the the damage was already done. The humiliation, the doubt, and the unnecessary spectacle had left their mark. As he walked toward his seat, the CEO could feel the lingering stares of the passengers. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed to have witnessed the ordeal, while others seemed almost satisfied that the situation had resolved as they had suspected it might. But he knew this was more than a boarding mishap. It was a blatant example of discrimination, a reminder that even with all his success, respect wasn't guaranteed. The humiliation he faced at the boarding gate should have ended the moment his ticket was confirmed valid, but for the Black CEO, it was only the beginning of an even deeper insult once he stepped into the cabin. With the supervisor's reluctant nod, he made his way down the narrow aisle toward the first-class section, holding his composure even as whispers and curious stares followed him. Some passengers, who had been pretending to scroll through their phones, couldn't resist turning their heads to get another look, as though trying to figure out what had made the flight attendant so suspicious in the first place. He kept his expression calm, but every step carried the weight of what had just happened. When he reached his assigned seat, the ordeal did not end. The same flight attendant who had doubted his presence earlier intercepted him once again, blocking his way with a forced smile that failed to conceal her irritation. Instead of offering the standard warmth and courtesy reserved for first-class passengers, she treated him as though his presence was an inconvenience. Her body language was rigid, her tone clipped, and her eyes still carried that same disbelief, as though she was waiting for someone else to come along and confirm her suspicions all over again. "Sir, you'll need to put your bag in the overhead compartment quickly," she said curtly, her voice sharp in a way that was not used with the other passengers around him. He glanced around and noticed how other travelers were being greeted with polite small talk, their belongings carefully stowed by helpful attendants, and their comfort checked with genuine concern. Yet, when it came to him, every word, every gesture seemed laced with impatience. He slid into his seat quietly, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing frustration cross his face. But the humiliation didn't stop there. As she moved through the cabin, offering champagne and menus to the other first-class passengers, she deliberately skipped over him. He watched as crystal glasses of sparkling wine were placed gracefully onto the trays of those around him, smiles exchanged, polite laughter shared. Yet, when she reached his row, she passed by as though he wasn't even sitting there. The exclusion was deliberate, calculated, and carried out in full view of the other passengers. The CEO sat silently, his eyes fixed forward, but the sting of the public slight burned deeply. He wasn't being overlooked by mistake. He was being denied the same service as those around him, treated as though he had smuggled himself into a space reserved for people who, in her mind, deserve better. A few passengers nearby noticed the unfairness. Some looked at him with sympathy, clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, while others chose to remain detached, unwilling to get involved in what they saw as none of their business. A couple seated across the aisle exchanged a glance, whispering quietly to each other before stealing quick looks at him. He could sense the silent question running through their minds: why was this man being treated differently? But no one spoke up. The silence of the cabin was as loud as the discrimination itself. Later, when the meal service began, the pattern repeated. The flight attendant stopped at each seat, politely asking for orders, explaining options, and smiling as she interacted with passengers who looked the way she thought first-class travelers should look. When she reached his row, her tone was icy. She rattled off the choices quickly, without care or effort, and scribbled his selection onto her notepad without making eye contact. The contrast was unmistakable. Where others received warmth and charm, he was met with cold efficiency, delivered in a way that reinforced the message, "You don't belong here." What cut deeper than the tone of her words was the way she performed the humiliation in front of others. There was no attempt to conceal her disdain, no effort to mask her judgment. Instead, she seemed to relish in making sure others saw the difference in treatment. It wasn't just about excluding him from comfort. It was about diminishing his status in a space that was supposed to celebrate it. As the hours passed, the CEO reflected on how calculated the disrespect had become. The flight attendant had not only questioned his right to sit in first class but had used every opportunity to remind him of her perception, that his success and his presence in that cabin were undeserved. Each skipped courtesy, each cold word, and each deliberate exclusion added to the quiet storm building within him. This was not about a simple lapse in service or a busy attendant overlooking a passenger. This was targeted. The humiliation wasn't hidden behind excuses or misunderstandings. It was open, intentional, and public. She had made him a spectacle at the gate, and now she was making him a spectacle in the air, surrounded by witnesses who chose either silence or indifference. The CEO's calm demeanor never faltered. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, and didn't retaliate with words in the moment. He simply observed, quietly absorbing every detail of the humiliation being inflicted upon him. He understood the power of patience, the strength in allowing others to reveal their true character without interference. Every insult, every slight, was quietly noted, not in anger, but in preparation. He knew that moments like these, though painful, often carried opportunities hidden within them. The CEO sat in his seat, composed and silent, though inside his mind was a storm of emotions. Years of experience had taught him to master his reactions, to keep his dignity intact even when confronted with blatant disrespect. He knew that anger in moments like these only confirmed the prejudices of those waiting to see it. Instead of allowing the humiliation to break him, he began to channel it into something sharper, calm, calculated response. His silence was not submission, it was strategy. He observed every detail of how he was being treated, memorizing the expressions, the words, the tone, and the sequence of events that had unfolded since the moment he arrived at the gate. As the plane settled into its flight path and the cabin lights dimmed, he reclined slightly and closed his eyes, but not to rest. He was processing, thinking ahead, considering the weight of his position and the authority he carried. This was not the first time he had faced prejudice, and sadly, it might not be the last. But what set him apart was his ability to transform situations of disrespect into opportunities for powerful lessons. He knew that revenge wasn't always about retaliation in the heat of the moment. Sometimes the most effective response was quiet, patient, and executed with precision long after the offender thought they had won. He opened his eyes briefly and noticed the flight attendant moving down the aisle again, her smile warm for others, her demeanor cold when her eyes passed over him. He didn't flinch. Instead, he straightened his posture, adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, and reminded himself of who he was. His success was not an accident, it was the result of relentless effort, intelligence, and the refusal to let obstacles define him. He had overcome far greater barriers than the disdain of a prejudiced attendant, and this incident, while painful, was another opportunity to demonstrate the strength of restraint. Every time she bypassed him, every time she spoke to him in that clipped tone, he responded with unshaken calm. A polite nod, a simple "thank you," nothing more, nothing less. Where she expected frustration, he gave patience. Where she tried to provoke, he offered composure. This quiet strength unsettled her more than anger ever could. He could see it in her eyes when she glanced his way, searching for a crack in his demeanor, waiting for him to confirm her assumptions. But he refused to give her the satisfaction. The passengers around him began to notice the difference. A few exchanged subtle looks, some whispering quietly to one another. They could see the contrast between how others were treated and how he was being handled. The injustice was clear, but still, no one spoke up. The silence was heavy, a reflection of how discrimination often thrived in the absence of intervention. Yet the CEO did not hold it against them. He understood that many people chose comfort over confrontation, that silence was often easier than standing against wrong. It was precisely why he knew his response had to be bigger than just himself. In his mind, he was already planning the next steps. He would not confront her directly. That would only reduce the situation to a personal conflict. Instead, he would use the influence he had built over years in business, the connections he had with executives, stakeholders, and even the aviation industry. He knew that airlines depended on reputation as much as revenue, and one incident mishandled could ripple outward in ways that no company could afford. The thought gave him a quiet sense of assurance. While she saw him as just another passenger, he knew he was far more than that. He glanced at his watch and then out the window, the clouds drifting by as if mocking the turbulence inside the cabin. He allowed himself a small smile, not for the present humiliation, but for the certainty of what was to come. Revenge, in his mind, was not about pettiness. It was about justice delivered with impact. He didn't need to raise his voice or demand attention now. All he needed to do was wait, and when the right moment came, he would act in a way that no one could ignore. The strength of his calmness began to affect the atmosphere around him. Passengers who had initially dismissed the situation as just another inconvenience started to view him differently. They saw the dignity in his silence, the quiet authority in the way he carried himself, and the refusal to be diminished by open hostility. It was as if his composure created a counterweight to the attendant's disrespect, shifting the balance of the unspoken power dynamic in the cabin. When she approached him later with another dismissive gesture, he looked her directly in the eyes, not with anger, but with a steady gaze that conveyed control. That simple act unsettled her, and she quickly moved on without another word. It was in that moment he realized the depth of his influence. He didn't need to say much. His restraint was already unraveling her confidence. Her hostility had been designed to break him down, but instead, it was exposing her lack of professionalism to anyone paying attention. The CEO leaned back in his seat again, his thoughts calm and focused. He had made his decision. His response would not be an outburst on the plane. It would be a reminder to her and to the airline that disrespect carried consequences. His patience was not weakness, but the prelude to something greater. He would let the flight continue, let the hours pass, and let her believe she had gotten away with it. Because when the time came, his measured, calculated response would not only defend his dignity but send a message that no one in her position would ever forget. As the plane touched down and passengers began to gather their belongings, the black CEO remained composed, moving with quiet precision as he collected his briefcase and jacket. The humiliation he had endured throughout the flight had been painful, but his calm response was not without purpose. He had allowed the situation to unfold exactly as it did, absorbing every detail, not because he was powerless, but because he understood the strength of waiting. Now, with the flight behind him, it was time to draw upon the authority and influence he had cultivated over years of success to address the injustice he had experienced. The flight attendant who had targeted him still carried herself with an air of superiority, avoiding his eyes as she hurriedly helped other passengers disembark. To her, the matter was finished. She had humiliated him, diminished him in front of others, and now it would be forgotten as just another flight. What she didn't realize was that the man she had disrespected was not just another customer. He was a leader, a strategist, a figure with connections that stretched into industries far beyond her imagination. The uniform she wore and the authority she thought she had on the plane were small compared to the reach and influence he possessed beyond it. As he stepped off the aircraft, he didn't storm toward a manager or demand an immediate confrontation. Instead, he walked calmly through the terminal, his mind already calculating the most effective way to ensure that this injustice would not be brushed aside. He knew that complaints made in anger often disappeared into bureaucratic processes, dismissed as the frustrations of passengers. But a complaint made with precision, backed by influence and authority, could not be ignored. Once settled in the lounge, he opened his laptop and began composing an account of the incident. Every detail was laid out with clarity. The moment at the gate when his ticket was questioned, the public humiliation of being asked to step aside, the deliberate exclusion during the flight, and the cold, clipped responses that had separated him from every other passenger in first class. His words were not emotional but deliberate, sharp, and professional, designed to highlight the clear pattern of discrimination that had unfolded in plain view. He attached the letter to an email and sent it directly to the airline's senior leadership. But he didn't stop there. He had contacts within the aviation industry, regulators, and business circles where reputations mattered as much as profit margins. He knew exactly who to copy on the email, ensuring that the incident would not be quietly buried. He also had a seat on advisory boards and committees that directly influenced how corporations like this airline operated. His voice wasn't that of a single passenger complaining about mistreatment. It was the voice of someone whose opinion carried weight, whose story could shape policy, whose influence could reach far beyond one individual. His calmness during the ordeal now revealed its full purpose. Because he had not raised his voice, because he had not lashed out in the moment, his account carried an air of authority that could not be dismissed as exaggeration. The power of restraint made his words stronger, his claims more credible, and his demand for accountability undeniable. He wasn't simply asking for an apology. He was making it clear that discrimination disguised as procedure or authority would not go unnoticed, not when directed at him, and not when directed at anyone else. Within hours, responses began to arrive. Executives who normally operated behind layers of corporate shields were now personally replying, expressing concern, requesting meetings, and offering apologies. He remained measured in his replies, never rushing, never appearing desperate for resolution. He understood the importance of letting them see that this was not about appeasing one customer but about addressing a systemic issue that could cost them dearly if left unchecked. The airline's leadership soon realized the seriousness of the matter. A man of his stature could easily take the story public, and in a world where reputations were fragile, the headline of a black CEO being humiliated and excluded in first class could spark outrage, boycotts, and reputational damage that no amount of marketing could repair. They also recognized the weight of his network, the people who would listen if he spoke, the organizations that would act if he demanded change. In private meetings that followed, the CEO was firm but calm, recounting the details of his experience, and making it clear that accountability was not negotiable. He wasn't there to demand compensation or free flights. His authority was bigger than that. He was there to demand systemic change, better training, and consequences for those who abused their positions to demean others. The flight attendants' actions were not just personal insults. They were a reflection of a wider culture that tolerated prejudice in subtle and overt ways. By using his influence strategically, he shifted the narrative. What the flight attendant had intended as humiliation became the foundation for a conversation that would shake the company at its core. Executives were forced to recognize the gravity of what had happened, not just because of who he was, but because of how he had chosen to respond. Calm, deliberate, and backed by authority, his actions made it impossible for them to dismiss his experience as just another complaint. His response was not an outburst but a reminder of the weight of true power. Authority, when used wisely, doesn't need to shout to be heard. It doesn't need to rage to command change. It speaks with calm certainty, and it forces others to listen. In choosing restraint during the flight and strategy afterward, the CEO turned his authority into a weapon far sharper than anger could ever be. The consequences for the airline staff did not arrive immediately, but when they came, they were decisive and far-reaching. The CEO's account, delivered with precision and authority, had traveled through channels that most employees in uniform could never imagine. Executives at the highest level of the airline convened behind closed doors, aware that the situation had spiraled far beyond a customer service mishap. They understood the gravity of having a respected black CEO publicly humiliated in first class, and they knew that allowing the incident to be dismissed would risk their credibility, their reputation, and their business relationships. The flight attendant who had initiated the humiliation still believed she had done nothing wrong. To her, her actions had been justified, rooted in assumptions she had long held about who did and didn't belong in spaces of privilege. But those assumptions, carried out so openly, now stood as evidence of unprofessionalism and discrimination. When she was called into a meeting with her supervisors, her confidence quickly began to unravel. The language in the reports was clear, the details undeniable, and the voices from leadership left no room for interpretation. What she thought had been a small exercise of authority on a single flight was now being scrutinized as a violation of the airline's core values. She tried to defend herself, suggesting that she was only following protocol, that her actions had been about ensuring order on the flight. But the documentation presented against her told a different story. Passenger testimonies described her dismissive tone, her selective service, and her clear bias in handling one individual differently from everyone else in the cabin. The contrast was too sharp to deny. Where other first-class passengers had received courtesy, she had delivered humiliation. Where others had been offered comfort, she had withheld even basic acknowledgement. The airline's leadership could not afford to protect her. In an industry built on image and trust, the optics of defending an employee who had publicly humiliated a black CEO were devastating. The decision was swift. She was suspended from her role while a broader investigation was launched, and whispers began to spread among her colleagues about whether she would ever return to the skies in uniform. For someone who had once believed her position gave her power over passengers, the sudden collapse of that illusion was crushing. But the consequences did not stop with her. The supervisor who had initially been summoned to check the CEO's ticket was also questioned. Why had he not intervened earlier? Why had he allowed the humiliation to escalate instead of defusing it immediately? His failure to act became part of the broader narrative, an example of how complicity can be as damaging as direct action. He faced disciplinary measures of his own, a stern warning placed in his record and the clear understanding that any further lapse would end his career. The airline, desperate to contain the damage, went beyond punishing individuals. They were forced to confront the culture that had allowed such behavior to thrive unchecked. Training programs were reevaluated, mandatory courses on bias and customer respect were introduced, and managers were instructed to monitor interactions more closely. None of these changes were born from goodwill alone. They were driven by the pressure created by the CEO's influence. His story had reached boardrooms, advisory committees, and industry regulators. The company knew that without visible reform, they risked being branded as indifferent to discrimination. For the CEO, the consequences unfolding behind the scenes were not a matter of personal satisfaction, but a demonstration of accountability. He had not raised his voice during the flight because he understood that true justice often comes later, when those in power are forced to acknowledge what they ignored in the moment. Watching the airline scramble to repair its image was proof that silence, when paired with strategy, could be louder than any outburst. Meanwhile, the flight attendant's colleagues began to distance themselves from her. Some whispered that they had seen her behave this way before, though never in such a high-profile situation. Others admitted quietly that they had harbored similar biases but had never been called out. The incident became a mirror for the staff, reflecting uncomfortable truths about the ways passengers were judged and treated differently based on appearance. What had once been routine assumptions now carried the threat of real consequences, and the ripple effect was undeniable. Passengers, too, began to play a role. Those who had witnessed the humiliation firsthand were later contacted by the airline, asked to provide accounts of what they had seen. Several spoke of the unfairness, of the way the attendant's hostility had been obvious, and of the CEO's remarkable calmness in response. Their voices, once silent during the flight, now became part of the case against her. The very passengers who had sat quietly in their seats became key witnesses in ensuring accountability was enforced. For the airline staff, the incident became a cautionary tale. It spread quickly among employees, told in hushed tones during training sessions and staff meetings. The message was clear: no passenger should ever be judged by appearance, and no assumption should override the dignity and respect owed to those who had earned their place. It was not simply about avoiding scandal but about understanding the power dynamics at play in every interaction. The humiliation of one man had exposed the flaws in an entire system, forcing change where it had long been ignored. And while the flight attendant struggled with the weight of her actions, facing the reality of a career abruptly cut short, the CEO's quiet response had ensured that her behavior did not disappear into silence. The consequences were not just hers to bear but a reminder to everyone in her profession that arrogance, prejudice, and abuse of authority always find their way back to those who practice them. The story of the black CEO's ordeal on the flight carried with it a lesson far greater than the humiliation of one man or the consequences faced by a single flight attendant. At its core, it was a reminder that appearances can deceive, and judgment based on surface assumptions can unravel in the most unexpected ways. The attendant had looked at him and seen someone who, in her mind, didn't belong in first class. She had let stereotypes guide her actions, believing that his presence in that premium cabin must be a mistake, an error to be corrected rather than a right to be respected. Yet the very person she sought to diminish turned out to be someone whose power, influence, and authority stretched far beyond her limited perception. The lesson was clear: never judge by appearance. The CEO's calm, calculated response was not only an act of personal dignity but also a demonstration of how misplaced judgments can backfire. The attendant had assumed that she held the power in the situation, that her uniform and her role gave her the authority to strip him of respect. What she failed to realize was that true power does not always announce itself. It doesn't always wear the clothing or speak the language one expects. It can be quiet, understated, and hidden in plain sight until the moment it chooses to reveal itself. For the passengers who had witnessed the incident, the story stayed with them long after they left the plane. Some had felt sympathy in the moment, others guilt for not speaking up, but all were left with the undeniable awareness of how easily bias could lead to cruelty. They had watched a man treated as though he didn't belong, only to discover that he was someone who not only belonged but who also had the means to hold an entire corporation accountable. The silence of the cabin, the avoidance of confrontation, became part of their own reflection. It reminded them that when injustice occurs, watching quietly is not the same as neutrality, it is participation. For the airline, the reminder was equally profound. Training manuals and corporate slogans had long spoken of customer respect and equal treatment, but the incident revealed how fragile those commitments were when left to individual bias. A single employee's judgment had placed the entire company at risk, threatening its reputation and exposing its vulnerability to public scrutiny. It forced executives and staff alike to confront the uncomfortable truth that prejudice could live within their ranks, hidden behind polite smiles and professional uniforms until it surfaced in moments of unchecked authority. The CEO's experience resonated far beyond the walls of that airline. His story was shared in boardrooms, conferences, and quiet conversations among leaders who understood the deeper message. Success is not always visible on the surface, and wealth or power does not always conform to the expectations of those who believe they can measure worth by appearance. His composure became a model, not just of how to handle disrespect, but of how to use position and influence to transform personal pain into systemic accountability. The reminder also carried weight for those who, like the flight attendant, had grown comfortable in their assumptions. It exposed the danger of underestimating people, of deciding their value based on what they look like, where they sit, or how they are perceived. The uniform she wore had given her a false sense of superiority, but it collapsed the moment her actions were placed under the scrutiny of someone she had underestimated. In believing she was humiliating him, she had only set the stage for her own downfall. Beyond the corporate halls and the passengers on that flight, the lesson stretched into society at large. How often are people misjudged because of their skin color, their clothing, their accent, or their quiet demeanor? How often are doors closed to those who deserve to walk through them, simply because others assume they do not belong? The CEO's story was not just about one flight or one attendant, it was a reflection of countless moments in which prejudice defines interactions and robs individuals of the dignity they deserve. His calm refusal to be diminished was a challenge to that reality, a call for others to recognize that appearances are shallow, and true worth cannot be measured at a glance. Even for those who had no direct connection to the incident, hearing about it became a point of reflection. People began to ask themselves how they might have reacted in his place, or in the place of the silent passengers who had watched. Would they have spoken up? Would they have intervened? Or would they have remained quiet, complicit in the face of injustice? The story urged them to examine their own responses to bias and to recognize the role they play in either allowing discrimination to continue or standing against it. The power of the CEO's restraint and eventual response lay in its universality. He had not simply sought revenge for himself, he had delivered a lesson for all to witness. By holding the airline accountable and exposing the consequences of misjudgment, he had turned personal humiliation into collective education. The story became less about the man who was mistreated and more about the dangers of treating anyone as though they do not belong. In the end, the reminder was etched deeply into every layer of the incident, from the flight attendant who lost her career, to the supervisors who faced disciplinary action, to the airline that was forced to re-examine its culture, and to the passengers who walked away with an unforgettable memory of prejudice revealed and power reclaimed. The quiet man in the tailored suit had shown them all that assumptions are fragile, and judgment without knowledge is the quickest path to downfall.